The first headlines called it a private drama that accidentally leaked onto the world stage. But in truth, what detonated inside the Vatican that warm Roman spring was always larger than one family, larger even than the church itself. It was the irresistible spectacle of a wound healing in public view. At dawn on the 27th day of his pontificate, Pope Leo XIV, a man still trying to memorize the labyrinth of frescoed corridors that now counted as home, was already awake in his study, shuffling notes for a homily on hope after war, when a junior aide placed a single cream-colored envelope atop those pages and unwittingly rewrote global conversation for a generation. No courier trumpeted, no Swiss guard saluted. The envelope arrived the way regret often does, politely, almost apologetically, yet hot enough to burn a hole through decades of carefully laid emotional armor. Observers would later swear they felt the very atmosphere of the apostolic palace tilt, as if gravity itself grew heavier around the pontiff's shoulders. They weren't wrong. The Pope, born Robert Francis Prevost, stared at the shaky hand scrawl of his father's name, Louis Marius Prevost, and for a stretched heartbeat forgot the weight of 2,000 years of tradition balancing on his signature. Eyes closed, he was 7 again, October 1962, peering through a cracked bedroom door at a man's silhouette framed in hallway light, hearing the hushed click of a suitcase clasp latching, the scrape of leather soles on tile, and finally the dreaded percussion of a front door shutting with such finality that the noise lodged permanently between his ribs. So many memories are pliable, but the sound of abandonment hardens into granite. The letter, 6 pages of ink blotched by what could only be tears or spilled varnish from the furniture workshop where Louis had spent half a century hiding from his own shame, contained no self-justification. Instead, it was all confession. The booze, the panic, the factory layoff that detonated his self-worth, the conviction that he would corrode the family from within and that escape was a grotesque act of love. He admitted to haunting small-town Italian bars on Sunday mornings just to glimpse newspaper photos of the boy he'd left. Altar server robes too big, adolescence filled out under a seminary cassock, bishop's mitre perched on hair gone silver too soon. He owned the truth that every milestone photo felt both balm and brand, proof of the son's improbable flourishing and of the father's unbearable absence in that frame. "I am not asking you to forgive," the letter concluded. "I am only asking you to know I never stopped seeing you, even from the shadows." Pope Leo XIV didn't weep elegantly. His aides, trained to maintain impassive faces while processing crisis briefs, froze as their leader's shoulders began to convulse under the simple black house cassock. Not decorous tears, but jagged sobs clawed free, as if the boy he had locked inside for 60 years had finally punched his way out. When the wave receded, Robert staggered into the small private chapel adjoining his office, laid the letter before the tabernacle, and knelt on marble, forehead pressed to the floor. He asked God, not in the polished Latin of pontifical documents, but in raw Chicago accented English of his childhood, "What do you want me to do with this?" Silence answered, the rich, ringing silence of a vaulted space at dawn. But within that hush he felt, unmistakably, a tug. Go. No media strategy, no diplomatic choreography, just go. The notion felt impossible. Security staff rehearsed nightmares about kidnappings. Protocol officers wrote multi-page memos before the Pope so much as crossed the corridor. And yet the directive did not retreat. It felt, he would later tell trusted Cardinal Joseph Treddy, like a hook in the sternum pulling his body toward Milan. Treddy, seasoned in Vatican intrigue, but also in the Pope's personal history, listened without blinking. "Holiness," he said quietly, "you've sent thousands to the confessional to risk everything on mercy. God is inviting you to practice what you preach." That night, the Pope slipped a plain black jacket over clerical collar, left the white zacchetto folded on his desk like an unneeded crown, and climbed into an unmarked Fiat driven by a single plainclothes guard who looked uncomfortable with the lack of caravan. They drove north past midnight truck stops where drivers fueled up on bitter espresso, past fields where moonlight silvered rows of still bare grapevines, and past city outskirts where neon casino signs blinked like restless conscience. Each kilometer peeled another layer of papal insulation until, as dawn stained the sky pink over the Milanese suburbs, Robert felt more sun than sovereign pontiff. Louis's address sat above a shuttered bakery, third floor, paint flaking from a balcony railing just wide enough for a pot of basil and one rusted folding chair. The Pope's fingers trembled as he pressed the buzzer. Footsteps approached. The door opened as though the occupant had spent hours standing just behind it, too keyed up to sit. Father and son stared. Two faces, same nose, same wary up tilt of the eyebrows when startled. For a stretch of seconds, neither moved. The air charged like a struck match waiting for flame. Then Louis whispered Robert, the syllables scratching out of a throat and used to speaking the holy name of his own child. And Robert answered Papa, the word bursting automatic, amazed, and there it was, reunion and reckoning fused in one tremor of sound. Inside, every surface bore witness. Newspaper clippings thumb-tacked in careful rows formed a timeline of Robert's ecclesiastical ascent. Early articles were yellowed, corners brittle. Later pieces glossy, edges crisp. One photo captured Robert at age 25 lifting a chalice. Louis had circled the image in red pen, as if annotating proof that the child he abandoned had still become something luminous. Another, from just weeks earlier, showed the papal balcony moment. The caption's ink hadn't yet fully dried, evidence of how fresh this new era truly was. The Pope ran a finger along the collage, marveling at the devotion embedded in clandestine collection. The irony nearly knocked the breath from him. Here was the presence he'd craved all his life, hidden in plain sight on a stranger's living room wall. They talked for hours, the conversation looping through half-finished sentences and long silences weighted with memory. Louis admitted the night he left he walked to the train station convinced he would buy a ticket to anywhere, return within the week bearing a new job, pockets full of gifts. Shame metastasized fast. The longer he stayed away, the more grotesque the idea of coming back became. He lived alone, perfecting the craft of building kitchen tables no one would gather around. Each birthday of the boy he deserted, he measured by the ring of cigarette burn marks on the workshop's scarred wooden bench. He showed Robert a drawer jammed with letters begun but never sent, sheets abandoned after 3 paragraphs, ink smudged by tears or spilled turpentine. Each false start a fresh self-indictment. Robert answered with quieter confessions of his own. How at seminary he'd kneel in the chapel after night prayers, asking God why love could vanish like that, and whether divine love was equally conditional. How every success felt vaguely fraudulent, because the cheer from the crowd did not include the single voice he imagined above all others. How he'd thought forgiving a world of souls would be easier than forgiving one man. When their words finally dwindled, Robert reached across the battered coffee table and enclosed his father's trembling hands in his own. "It isn't too late," he said, voice hoarse, "because we're still breathing." Louis, or Thomas, as he chose to rename himself at Robert's urging, resurrecting the baptismal name of the apostle who doubted but ultimately believed, expected perhaps a private reconciliation and then a discreet goodbye. What he couldn't envision was the Pope's next sentence, "Come home with me." Home meant Rome, the epicenter of a church that had spent centuries mastering ceremonial theater, yet was about to witness its most unscripted act in living memory. The news cycle discovered the story when train passengers snapped grainy photos of the Pope guiding an elderly man through Milan Central with nothing but a carry-on bag. Twitter lit first, screaming speculation about secret diplomacy, hidden health crises, even conspiracy theories about a sibling rival for St. Peter's throne. By the time the pair arrived at Roma Termini, paparazzi lenses poked between iron pillars like hungry periscopes. Vatican press officers scrambled to draft statements, but found the narrative evolving faster than any bullet point they could type. The Pope waved cameras back with a gentle palm and mouth, "Later, not now." He wanted his father's first view of St. Peter's Basilica to be unclouded by flashbulb glare. That introduction happened at midnight. The vast square stood empty except for moonlight gilding Bernini's colonnades. Robert led Thomas across the bright cobbles until they stood dead center beneath Michelangelo's soaring dome. The immensity dwarfed them, but Thomas seemed transfixed not by architecture, but by his son's quiet pride. The Pope lifted an arm in a half-crescent, as though presenting a gift. "This is where I work," he said simply. Then, teasing, "I might have taken 1 or 2 steps up the career ladder since altar boy." Thomas barked a laugh that cracked into a sob. In the days that followed, the Vatican became both sanctuary and stage. Behind sealed doors, father and son shared ordinary rituals. Morning espresso on a terrace overlooking Vatican gardens. Debates over soccer teams. Thomas still loyal to AC Milan. Robert adopting Roma for local patriotism. Late-night prayer in a candlelit chapel where Thomas confessed he felt unworthy to cross the threshold. Robert pressed into his father's calloused palm the wooden rosary that had traveled with him through every pivotal night of his life. Ordination vigil, conclave eve, sleepless hours before public apologies. "When your fingers ache," he whispered, "remember they're holding the same knots that steadied me." But there was also the external glare. Papal staff could not keep news of the reunion contained, nor in truth did Robert wish to. For decades, he had stood in confessionals hearing penitents sob about broken families, wives estranged from husbands, prodigal children swallowed by distance or addiction. If his personal story now possessed the dynamite to blow holes in shame's fortress walls, he would light the fuse publicly. Cardinal Tredi tried to gently map potential fallout. Conservative commentators might accuse the Pope of emotional exhibitionism. Diplomatic partners might resent coverage overshadowing treaty negotiations. Certain curial officials feared anything that didn't fit Latin document format. Robert listened, nodded, then gave the simplest counterargument Tredi ever heard. "If the gospel cannot survive 2 men hugging, we've been selling the wrong gospel." The general audience on a cloudless Wednesday drew pilgrims expecting standard catechesis. Instead, they witnessed history. Standing before a roaring crowd, the Pope set aside typed remarks, told the story of a 7-year-old who watched a door close and who spent the next 63 years wondering if home could still be reached. He described the letter, the midnight journey, the knock, the unimaginable yes. Then he pointed to a side stage entrance and beckoned. Thomas, knees knocking, shuffled into sunlight. When father and son embraced, the square erupted. Clergy sobbing openly, college students hoisting phones overhead, visiting dignitaries momentarily forgotten by their security teams as they wiped tears. One deaf pilgrim later posted a video of the moment with caption, "Couldn't hear applause, but felt the ground vibrate." That 12-second clip broke every view count record for religious content within 24 hours. But more remarkable than metrics were the human aftershocks. A Philippine journalist, long estranged from his alcoholic mother, borrowed camera equipment from his network, flew to Mindanao, and filmed their tear-drenched reunion, uploading it under the hashtag Second Embrace. An Argentinian prison warden arranged face-to-face visits between inmates and the families they hadn't seen in decades, citing the papal example. A Silicon Valley tech giant offered paid leave reconciliation sabbaticals. Suddenly, forgiveness was trending harder than scandal, and analysts called it the emotional equivalent of discovering a new clean energy source. Political players tried to harness the momentum. Diplomatic proposals rebranded as roadmaps to reconciliation filled UN inboxes. Peace envoys quoting papal speeches arrived in conflict zones, brandishing the story of Robert and Thomas as living proof that timelines of hate can be reversed. Not every delegation succeeded, and some skeptics blasted the phenomenon as sentimental politics, but even failure rates improved. International relations professors began assigning the event as a case study in the power of moral symbolism. Inside the Vatican, practical questions multiplied. Where would Thomas live? How could he contribute? Could a layman burdened with such past shame be entrusted with a role? Robert deflected bureaucracy by simple fiat. "He is my father. That is enough." He moved Thomas into the Domus Sancti Marthi, 2 doors down from his own modest suite. instructing staff to address him as senior provost unless he preferred something else. Thomas insisted on Thomas. He did not want the old name Louis, heavier with memories of abandonment. Within weeks, he developed a morning routine. Wake before sunrise, broom in hand, sweeping the small courtyard where gardeners stored terracotta pots. A Swiss guard tried to stop him once, citing protocol about residents performing menial tasks. Thomas smiled, thanked him, and kept sweeping. By month's end, the guard brought coffee. Not long after, the Pope launched La Via del Ritorno, literally the way back, an initiative pairing volunteer listener couples with families splintered by long-term silence. Parish halls from Lagos to Los Angeles buzzed on Saturday mornings with circles of folding chairs where stories spilled like cracked dams. Psychologists donated expertise. Airlines offered discounted tickets for reunion travel. Even telecom companies got involved, providing free long-distance minutes during designated mercy windows. Economists were astonished when early data showed communities participating in the program experienced measurable dips in violent crime and spikes in graduation rates within 2 years. Charity, it seemed, had macroeconomic implications. Thomas's own role morphed into something he never foresaw: storyteller-in-chief for the brokenhearted. He called his informal support group Padre Ferdi, wounded fathers, and invited men who believed they'd forfeited the right to parenthood. They met Wednesday nights in a disused Vatican laundry room that still smelled faintly of starch and soap, sitting on upturned crates, reading from a battered Italian translation of The Prodigal Son. They took turns rehearsing how they might begin a conversation with children they hadn't hugged in decades. Some wrote letters on the spot, their hands shaking. Thomas collected them, stamped them courtesy of a friendly nunciature clerk, and walked them to the Vatican postal office himself, praying over each envelope before it disappeared into the chute. The wall behind them soon filled with pinned postcards proclaiming miracles. He called me back. She wants to meet at Christmas. We're starting over. Not everyone responded with applause. A conservative radio host accused the Pope of weaponizing tears to distract from doctrinal slippage. A trending op-ed asked indignantly why the church celebrated a deadbeat dad, while so many saintly parents went unnoticed. Robert absorbed the criticism quietly. In a Sunday Angelus, he addressed it obliquely. Forgiveness does not endorse the wound. It announces the wound no longer controls the story. Privately, he acknowledged with treaty that some wounds, such as abuse, require justice before embrace. Thus, La Via del Ritorno incorporated guidelines from trauma specialists, ensuring reconciliation never coerced victims back into unsafe spaces. Amid global fervor, small domestic scenes sustained the momentum. Robert and Thomas would share lazy Sunday suppers. Simple lentil soup, crusty bread, a carafe of table wine, talking about how Chicago winters compared to Lombardy's damp cold. Sometimes Robert found himself narrating pieces of papal routine, the avalanche of diplomatic cables, the agony of drafting a homily that wouldn't be misquoted. Thomas listened, eyes bright, occasionally interjecting with dry humor. "Son, you negotiate peace between nations. I can hardly mediate between knots and shoelaces." They laughed, a sound so ordinary it seemed revolutionary in corridors long dominated by hushed decorum. If their story had ended there, father restored, program launched, #viral, historians might still have called it epical. But grace is greedy. It multiplies. 2 years into the movement, an unexpected byproduct emerged: interfaith echoes. Rabbis in New York collaborated with imams in Jakarta to host joint forgiveness symposiums, citing the Pope's witness as universal. Buddhist monks in Chiang Mai released lanterns into night skies inscribed with names of estranged loved ones. Even secular therapists adopted the language of second embrace to market group sessions. Analysts coined the phrase Leo effect to describe any viral compassion event triggered by a public figure's vulnerability. In the middle of this global swell, Robert faced personal milestones: the 10th anniversary of his papacy and his 75th birthday, automatic trigger for resignation consideration under church law. but he felt energized rather than weary, propelled by the movement his and Thomas's story had birthed. When pressed by journalists about retirement, he quipped, "I promised God 80 seasons, at least, one for every year my father and I missed, with round numbers left over for overtime." Yet time, unnegotiable, crept on. One winter Thomas came down with pneumonia. Vatican doctors, thrown into panic, discovered heart complications. In a private infirmary suite, Robert sat nightly, reading aloud from The Little Prince, a childhood favorite neither had shared but both knew. Thomas would close his eyes, smiling at the fox's secret about taming. On a bitter March dawn, as sparrows shrieked in leafless magnolia branches outside the window, Thomas exhaled a final breath, so soft it looked like surrender and victory at once. Robert, holding his hand, whispered the first psalm that surfaced, tears streaking unashamed. "Even if I walk in the valley of the shadow of death, I shall fear no evil." But of evil there was none, only release. Thomas's funeral was intimate, as promised. 30 mourners, mostly Padre Faraday members, huddled in a sun-washed olive grove south of Rome. Everyone wore simple linen. Robert declined state dignitaries, telling heads of state to plant trees in their homelands instead. He himself shoveled first earth onto the bier, muttering, "You built tables no family sat at. Now rest beneath a tree families will picnic under." The olive sapling planted above the grave was grafted from Gethsemane stock, a gift from Franciscan custodians. Newspapers ran headlines like "Father of Forgiveness Goes Home," but Robert ignored papers for weeks, choosing silence. Yet even grief became fuel. One night, pacing empty papal apartments, unable to sleep, Robert scrawled an outline for an encyclical that had haunted him for years, Canticle of the Returning. It would weave theology, neuroscience, and sociology into a manifesto arguing that reconciliation is not optional decoration, but the operating system of creation. He wrote in furious bursts, citations to parables, footnotes to family systems therapy, quotes from modern poets. The document ran 80 pages, a papal record for storytelling style, lacing doctrinal paragraphs with anecdote after anecdote of changed lives. When published, it stunned academicians and trended in youth subcultures that usually ignored papal missives. An indie band sampled its opening lines. Economists hosted panels debating its claim that nations thrive where citizens practice micro-reunions. For more years passed. Robert's hair thinned to wisps of silver. Arthritis crept into the hands once so deft at blessing crowds. One quiet August evening after Vespers, he requested a wheel-less office chair wheeled out to the middle of St. Peter's Square. An odd image, the Pope in a lone chair under emerging stars. Security imposed a perimeter but allowed him space. He watched tourists snap photos of the basilica facade, floodlights painting statues in gold. He thought of how, 6 decades earlier, a little boy stared at a door that closed. He thought of envelopes, of buses, of second chances, and he realized the square tonight was full of doors opening. Perhaps, he mused, the ultimate legacy of his pontificate would not be reforms or councils or even canonical of the returning. It would be all the unseen doors now swinging back on hinges once rusted stiff. The front porch in Manila where a grandmother greeted her runaway grandson. The Brooklyn apartment where twin brothers who hadn't spoken since 9/11 hugged and ugly cried. The hospital ICU in Johannesburg where a father whispered to his son stricken by new pandemic, "I should have come sooner." Each door a sacrament of movement. Each reconciliation a liturgy more powerful than incense. Years later, contemporary historians trying to quantify the Leo effect found statistical oddities. Suicide hotlines reporting sharp decreases in calls citing isolation. Adoption agencies compiling new categories called reunification successes. Even cybersecurity firms noting dips in revenge-driven hacking campaigns. None could claim causation definitively, but one data scientist wrote, "It's as though on a planetary level, humanity remembered for a season that the person across from them might one day save, or break, their heart, so they chose saving." Economists who once rolled eyes at mercy economy began including social cohesion indexes in growth projections. In university lecture halls, ethics professors screened the original general audience footage annually. Students still gasped at the embrace, even those born years after the fact. Proof the image retained electric power. Some classes ended with an assignment. Write a letter you'll never send. Strangely, most students ended up mailing theirs anyway. As for Pope Leo XIV, when he eventually submitted his resignation at 83, he added a handwritten note to the official decree. The world will always need one more letter, one more knock, one more yes. Keep the path cleared. His successor, rumored to have chosen the name Clement XV in quiet homage to mercy that Clement demands, pledged to continue La Via del Ritorno as permanent Vatican department. The olive tree shading Thomas's grave grew thick, its branches heavy with fruit pressed each autumn into a limited reserve oil bottled simply per nato. Sales funded scholarships for children of incarcerated parents. On the 10th anniversary of Thomas's death, Robert, now frail, hair white, and papal ring long removed, visited the grove. A small crowd followed discreetly, but he asked for solitude. He knelt, struggling, beside the headstone, ran a trembling hand over the inscription, Father, forgiven, free. Then he did something most passers-by would misinterpret. He laid his cheek against the earth and listened, as if expecting heartbeat. Perhaps he heard nothing but wind rattling olive leaves. Or perhaps he caught an echo older than creation, the hush of a door opening not on a departure, but onto life everlasting. When he rose, supported by a young seminarian, he spoke the final words of the visit, picked up by a journalist's directional mic 50 yards away and later printed everywhere. Mercy rusts on no hinge. The phrase circled the globe within hours, instantly hashtagged, carved into protest banners, inked into tattoos. But for Robert, it was simply summary. So the narrative many once dubbed a sentimental footnote in Vatican chronicles matured into something like a planetary parable. From a single envelope grew counseling centers, peace accords, revised national curriculums teaching conflict resolution alongside math. And somewhere tonight, in a dim kitchen, a middle-aged daughter stares at a father she once erased from every birthday wish list, both fumbling through a halting conversation that begins with, "Where did we even start to go wrong?" Their story is not yet headline, may never be, but it is precisely the sequel that matters most, because it is multiplied in apartments and bus stops and hospice rooms the world over. In the end, the epic of Pope Leo XIV and Thomas Prevost remains, at its core, bafflingly simple. One letter delivered, one door reopened, one embrace witnessed. 8,000 printed words cannot exhaust its ripples, because every time a new soul dares the terrifying freedom of forgiveness, the narrative expands, writing itself inside fresh hearts. Which means if you are reading or listening, right now, the story is waiting for you. The only prop required is whatever version of an envelope you've left unsent in the back drawer of your life. Pick it up. The door at the other end may surprise you by opening wider than you imagine, its hinges shining, utterly immune to rust.